Suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it?
I will basically, what's known as theodicy, I think. I'll say, bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I'd say.
And you think you're going to get in on that?
No, but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms. They're wrong. Now, if I died and it was Pluto, Hades, and if it was the 12 Greek gods, then I would have more truck with it, because the Greeks they didn't pretend not to be human in their appetites and in their capriciousness and in their unreasonableness. They didn't present themselves as being all-seeing, all-wise, all-kind, all-beneficent. Because the God who created this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac, utter maniac, totally selfish. We have to spend our life on our knees thanking him? What kind of God would do that? Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation in which that didn't exist. It is simply not acceptable. So, atheism is not just about not believing there's a God, but on the assumption that there is one. What kind of God is he? It's perfectly apparent that he is monstrous, utterly monstrous, and deserves no respect whatsoever. The moment you banish him, your life becomes simpler, purer, cleaner, more worth living.
Welcome to the desert of the real. Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is. Heresy comes from the Greek to make a choice, in the context of a choice beyond the conventional or any other orthodoxy. And choices beyond anything you could have conceived is what you will find here at Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. Broadcast from the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West. Always through the God above God that can.
Maybe it's true. Maybe God threw the dice once too often. Maybe he let us all down.
We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything. With all those choices. So that you can ultimately find the mystery that works for you and only you.
I want to live a real life. I don't want to dream any longer.
It was philosopher William James who said, God is all-powerful and all-knowing, and thus he can only know what is known and do what is possible. Not us, the seed of Seth, and those veterans of 1,000 psychic wars who have set the controls to the heart of the sun. We are drenched in gnosis, that salvific knowledge, that red pill suppository, and thus will soon know the unknown and do what is impossible, namely transcend all realities. After all, many New Age meerkats and Orthodox torgos make the mistake of thinking the Gnostics wanted to change reality, like all garden variety mystics.
How could you be worthy? You're all puppets, tangled in strings.
No, we don't change reality. We deconstruct it, overstep it, all to access etheric energies in the imaginal realms to assist in restoring the cosmos and unleash our inner infinity. We're not escaping anything but the imposed rules of hating angels and mad gods. After all, in a moment of event horizon gnosis, it was Groucho Marx who said, I'm not crazy about reality, but it's still the only place to get a decent meal.
A reality is just what we tell each other it is. Sane and insane could easily switch places if the insane were to become the majority. You would find yourself locked in a padded cell, wondering what happened to the world.
I am Abraxas, still calling myself that as a remnant of that MySpace and PHP forum age, where everyone had alter egos and avatars. And now everyone seemingly tells the truth, yet is further drawn into the surveillance state that makes the Archons oh so happy. Even as people do not realize their true selves on the internet are just as false. I do it too. Most of me just another broken note of the cosmic Borg song of Samsara.
Sticking feathers up your butt does not make you a chicken.
You created me. I didn't create some loser alter ego to make myself feel better.
But Abraxas rises above all and encompasses all, like the apex of a Hans Zimmer score, and makes you one with him. In my meat space incarnation, I am still Miguel Connor, saving divine sparks one Valis pink beam at a time since 2006. Together, we are as majestic as the jaw of Ron Perlman, as sublime as the forehead of Christina Ricci, and as mysterious as what happened to the career of Clive Owen. Welcome so much, you revenge of the myth, you words made of flesh, and you modern-day Tom Sawyers, your mind not for rent by any god or government. We're gonna do so many wonders together. Build vast futures of light instead of toiling in the present existentialist material porn we call this world. We're going to finally be free.
A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible.
You will get closer to freedom on this mid-February, the year of our Demiurge 2015. With a galactic tool you've heard of, surely, used, of course, but might not have used at all or really known correctly. That is the power of forgiveness. To discuss this is our astral guest, Richard Smoley, who incarnates at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his new book, The Deal, a guide to radical and complete forgiveness. Some people complain the alternative spiritualities don't grant enough praxis beyond saying calendars and upper middle class yoga classes.
What does Deepak Chopra have that I don't have?
He's been on Oprah.
Oprah!
Richard proves them wrong with his new excellent work that does grant a breathless journey through many wise teachings across history and meta-history, but with sensible instructions on how to use forgiveness as a release from the black iron prison, a transcending of reality as the Gnostics advise, and bringing those etheric energies to make one more individuated, more divine.
Yes, these are bruises from fighting. Yes, I'm comfortable with that. I am enlightened.
For more total recall, please listen to our past interviews with Richard on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, found on iTunes, YouTube, or our archive of past shows, where Richard expertly deals with such topics as prophecy, Eastern faiths, consciousness, love, medieval Gnostics and mystics, and so much more. Certainly explore his homepage, innerchristianity.com. That is innerchristianity.com. Richard always rocks the heterodox Kasbah, offers so many choices in his heresy, that annoys Saklas and his butt slaves in the establishment of this world we did not make.
Choice is an illusion created between those with power and those without.
Did the ancient Gnostics deal with the power of forgiveness? By their works, there doesn't seem to be that much. But you have to remember what Elaine Pagel said. In the ancient world, Orthodoxy was grade school, and Gnosticism was grad school. In other words, the Gnostics had already dealt with the foundation of ethics and morals, and now focus on those flights of the soul through the spheres of reality and unreality. Like the Nag Hammadi Library's On Baptism says, the first baptism is the forgiveness of sins. And like the Gospel of Truth says, Christ anoints, which brings forgiveness, mercy, and perfection. In other words, and it should be stressed, the first step into initiation to becoming a paladin for Sophia or a knight of Valis is to make sure you walk the good walk and do the good works. Then worry about expanding your consciousness into the pleroma.
I know we're all pretty small in the big scheme of things, and I suppose the most you can hope for is to make some kind of difference. But what kind of difference have I made? What in the world is better because of me?
Yao knows I've made that mistake in my life, not taking care of the least of my brothers before delving into magical arts. Nothing wrong with going back to grade school occasionally. Forgiveness is certainly a foundation many of us likely aren't doing right or close to right. And Richard's interview will show the way. Then you can finally say the words to creation that the Gnostic-minded Robert Frost did when he said, "Forgive, O Lord, my little jokes on thee, and I'll forgive thy great big one on me."
You've changed things. Forever. There's no going back.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here and there. Any assistance you might have. Please don't forget my Patreon campaign, where you donate every time I produce. And together, we can continue growing the greatest heretical community in the history of the multiverse. That eternal soundtrack of the counterculture. There are linkies at thegodabovegod.com that lead you to manners to support this Promethean venture. Your support is essential, and much appreciation to you crazy diamonds who support this red pill cafeteria on a weekly basis.
It's been a brilliant journey of self-awakening. Now you've simply got to ask yourself this. What is happiness to you?
Like I said earlier, we're gonna do so many wonders together. I just know it. I just know it. And one of them is to forgive so intensely as we tap into, yes, the power of forgiveness. But enough of my drivel. Let us to the interview with Richard Smoley on his book, The Deal, A Guide to Radical and Complete Forgiveness. Hello and goodbye as always.
What Horatio said was, how can a man die better than facing fearful odds?
Bro! Get inside! Get inside!
For the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods.
I created you, Jack. I am your god.
Fuck you, Sally.
This is the Aeon Byte interview. And with us, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined again, and always a pleasure of being joined by Richard Smoley. And he joins us to discuss his new book, The Deal, A Guide to Radical and Complete Forgiveness. How are you doing today, Richard?
Very well. It's good to be here.
Again, always glad to have you on. So tell us a bit about why you decide to write this book, Richard. It's a bit off. I've read all of your books, and usually these are wonderful and epic journeys from India through the different philosophies back to ancient Egypt, and traveling to the Middle Ages with the Cathars and other medieval mystics to our modern times. Always dealing with great concepts like consciousness, love, alternative Christianity. This is a bit of a departure, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's a much shorter and kind of more popularly oriented book than some of the others were. I mean, I certainly try to make all my books, as readable and as accessible as possible. But this is much more of a something that pretty much anyone can pick up, because forgiveness is a topic that's of interest to everyone, or should be. And that was kind of what led me to write it. I thought there was time to, one thing, make some things a little more clear about forgiveness. And I'd certainly worked with A Course in Miracles, a text you may be familiar with, for a long, long time.
Oh, yeah.
Its central is forgiveness. And I was interested in seeing how this might apply into daily life. I was at a point personally about a year and a half ago when things in my life were just very difficult, and the only way I could really see through coping with it was just simply to say, look, let it all go, just forgive everything and everyone, and ask for and accept complete forgiveness for yourself. While this didn't make my problems go away in a practical sense, the usual financial, various things like that, it did make it much easier to deal with them. I did feel, and still feel a year and a half later, that I'm a lot clearer, I'm a lot less anxious as a result of just doing that. So at the time, fairly soon after I did this, I got the idea of turning it into a book. It is a short book. It's less than 200 pages long. And it gives a guide, basically a step-by-step guide to, just a way to forgive everybody and ask for and accept complete forgiveness for yourself. And I think it's a powerful technique. I can honestly say it's worked powerfully for me. I believe it can help a lot of people as well. At the very least, I would say that forgiveness is something we need more of rather than less of in the world. And at the same time, there are a lot of misconceptions about forgiveness that I think keep people from being able to let things go in their past and even in their present as easily as they could. One of the things, for example, that is often in the back of people's minds, and I discuss this in the book, is that forgiveness is often confused with condoning. And the idea is, if I forgive someone, I'm going to turn myself into a doormat and let this person keep walking all over me. So I'm going to protect myself with my grievances against this person. I think this is a mistake. I think you definitely should not have to put up with abuse from anyone. And on the other hand, I don't think you need to go through life kind of armed with grievances in order to keep yourself free from abuse. If I were going to, have one message that I might want to communicate as a central point in this interview, I would say, forgiveness doesn't mean you have to take abuse from anybody. And I think that's an important point, because that is a very, very delicate issue with people, and they don't feel they can forgive because they would leave themselves defenseless otherwise. But I'm saying you can just simply let it all go. If someone has swindled you, yeah, forgive him. That doesn't mean you need to go back and let him swindle you again. But it will clear your mind considerably.
Yes, and you bring a lot of wonderful philosophical schools, and you tie them in together wonderfully, like all your other books. And on this, the issue of becoming a doormat when you forgive, which of course is a concern of many Westerners, as you point out, you write that the Kabbalah really offers one of the answers to keeping a balanced outlook. Doesn't it have to do with the two pillars or one of the two sides of the Sephiroth?
Yeah, there are 3 pillars on the tree of life. The one on the left is generally considered to be the pillar of severity, and the one on the right is the pillar of mercy. And one of the central teachings of the Kabbalah is the central pillar, as you might say, the pillar of consciousness. So if you're actually centered in yourself, particularly in your higher aspects of yourself, you are kind of equally poised between Hesed, which is mercy, and Gevura, which is literally means strength, but it's usually translated as severity. And there are times for one and there are times for the other. Anyone who's been a parent or is a parent knows that both of those are completely necessary. Loving your child does not involve letting him do anything, although some parents seem to mistakenly think it is. So that principle, I think, can be very, very useful in sorting out exactly how you can both forgive and live with a certain amount of integrity and safety in the world as it is now. And I think that point often, too, is obscured in discussions of forgiveness, where it's often seen as like condoning or codependency or something like that. And I'm saying it's really quite different from that, and should be quite different from that.
And for the listener, so they know, your book is not just a lot of philosophical schools and personal insights and you going around going, forgive, forgive, forgive. But you offer an actual praxis for forgiveness, don't you?
Yeah, it's called The Deal. And as I sort of say at the beginning, it's the best deal you'll ever get in your life because it doesn't cost anything. And you get rid of a lot of garbage, namely mental and emotional garbage, and you get peace of mind in exchange, all at no cost to you financially, and even in terms of an investment in time. And doing that particular exercise is, I would say a half hour or an hour of quiet time by yourself. You only need do it once. One thing I've also tried to emphasize in the book, that this deal, this practice of forgiveness, does not necessarily involve taking any external action. And you may need, as a result of this forgiveness that you're practicing, you may need to do certain things. You may need to change certain things in your life, but it contains no guidelines for doing that. Why? Because you have to decide your own guidelines. You probably will know and may very likely immediately know what it is you have to do. Do you have to make changes in your life? Do you have to make changes in relationships? That kind of thing. You may well, but that will be because you've decided to do that. Another thing that I emphasize is that you can do this totally privately. In fact, unless there's a group of people who want to get together and do it together, which is certainly possible, you should be discreet about it. Because if this is of any value, it does need to be, shall we say, safeguarded, particularly in its infancy. And going around and telling everyone, I've just forgiven everybody, may set you up for some rather rude responses that won't necessarily help the process. If you want to talk about it, it's probably better to say, well, I'm just trying to be a little more forgiving. Most people can deal with that. Radical and complete forgiveness, which is what the book is about, is a much harder concept to swallow. And I notice even friends of mine, I discuss a book with a guy, they sound a little bit nervous about it because, of course, everybody in principle believes in forgiveness, but everyone also has the idea that forgiveness is going to kind of cost you something, whether it's your safety, your integrity, even money. It does actually, the deal does actually talk a little bit about the forgiveness of debts. And this has a number of dimensions. In the first place, much of it is inspired by a verse in the Lord's Prayer, which correctly translated is, "Forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors." So there is a certain kind of exchange implied in that. It also is debts and not trespasses, and it is as we have forgiven, not as we forgive. That is the literal and accurate translation of the Greek of the Gospel of Matthew. And forgiving debts is actually quite important because there are a lot of things that people owe one another. Let's in addition to money, people owe other people phone calls, Christmas cards, owe them a dinner, owe them, an invitation. There are all kinds of social obligations that, if you violate them, are not sins or crimes in anyone's book, but they do hang over our heads. They do hang over your head, something kind of left undone, or some other person has left undone. They didn't send me a Christmas card this year, so the hell with them. And, the deal is sort of saying, it's really a good idea to let that go as well. In terms of forgiving financial debts, that's something you can do or not do. It doesn't require forgiveness of financial debts, by the way. It incorporates that as somewhat of a suggestion. Sometimes, quite frankly, you've lent somebody money and you know kind of deep in your mind that you're never going to get that money. Yeah. So just let it go. Of course, forgiving debts is, in a way, sounds kind of Pollyannish and unrealistic. What if I were to make the suggestion, say, to a convention of bankers? Would they laugh and sneer about forgiving financial debts? Yes, they would. On the other hand, they went to the government and begged for a lot of forgiveness a few years ago and got it.
Oh, yeah, good.
So they, in terms of business, while I certainly don't expect to call my credit card company and say, "Hey, I'm practicing forgiveness, so how about wiping out my bill?" Even in financial terms, it could be used more than it is.
And I found it interesting, Richard, in the dice game of Shiva, you call consciousness the ability of self to relate to other. Mm-hmm. In the deal, you actually say, and of course you've dealt with love in your book, Conscious Love, you talk about how love is the ability of self to connect with other. Mm-hmm. So is forgiveness the ability of self to release other?
Yeah. It's not quite as broad a concept as consciousness or love, which, in first case, to be conscious, to exist at all, anything, has to have some kind of sense of self or other versus other. I say that there's even some kind of primitive version of that, even in inanimate objects, submolecular particles, and then a hydrogen atom has to know how to recognize an oxygen atom in some very mechanical and elementary way in order to bind with it and form water under certain circumstances. Love is what unites self and other while kind of preserving the integrity of each. That is to say, you love the other person, but you don't want to eat them, even though there is, I love you so much I could just eat you up. It's never been a very appetizing thought to me. And forgiveness is not quite as basic a concept of that. It's simply kind of a mental clearing. Can you forgive people without loving them? Yes, you can. You probably don't love a lot of people you have to forgive, but it's still a useful thing to do. Again, very much as a matter of self-interest. All of these things, these grievances, whether they're against your parents, the sixth grade teacher that you hated, the girlfriend, you had 20 years ago, your ex-spouse. All of those things are, they're mental and emotional shackles and burdens. If you can let them go, and I'm suggesting it's maybe easier to do it than you may think, it will give you a lot of time and mental space for positive things, whatever it is you want to do, whatever you find enjoyable and interesting. So it is very much, I'd say, a matter of self-interest.
Oh yeah, agreed, Richard. And on the flip side, or the flipping the coin, or whatever you want to call it, the alternatives, of course, is a resentment. And I know you say you don't have experience with 12-step programs. I have, and of course, they always talk about how resentment is really the drug you take when you've gotten rid of all your other drugs, and it's just as powerful and as destructive. How could you tell us a bit about resentment on your view, or as you call it, that treacherous armor?
Yeah, it's, it is to some extent a type of armoring because the belief underlying resentment, grudges, grievances, whatever you want to call it, they're all variations on the same theme, is that somehow it will defend you or protect you. It will somehow keep you from being harmed. The idea is if you don't have this resentment, you're in a sense going to walk around naked at the mercy of everyone. Now, there's another side to it, which is equally important, which is the wonderful matter of justice. Your resentment often comes from a sense of justice or fairness. If you resent someone or something, you feel that you, or possibly even someone else, has been unfairly treated. The way the mind often punishes the person who's done this bad thing, whatever it is by holding resentment against him. But of course, the other person is not or only minimally affected by your resentment. The person you're making suffer is yourself. And as I say in the book, there is a saying that not forgiving someone and expecting to make them suffer is like taking poison and expecting it to kill someone else. So again, you're doing this, and whether you're taking up arms against the injustices of the world, and might be worth talking about that whole aspect of it at some point in this interview.
Sure.
Or against yourself, it doesn't really work very well. I think you can protect yourself, and I don't think justice is violated by your letting resentments go, because the resentment involved in the justice involved in resentment doesn't really fit the crime, and it isn't primarily directed even at the person who you're mad at.
Why don't we talk about how forgiveness can help us cope with this world? I mean, we're talking about forgiveness of my spouse or my dad or my boss at work or whatever. But how can resentment help me deal with the Republicans or the Democrats or ISIS or the bankers? How can this help, Richard?
Well, again, your resentments against the Republicans or Democrats or whoever you like is not really going to change very much. What's very interesting on Facebook is, of course, like you, I'm sure I have lots of friends who post all sorts of, politically, damaging things, the latest of those things those people are doing next. Now, if you have some idea that this is maybe kind of introducing some positive change in the world, I would suggest you're wrong, because, even on Facebook, the people who see this, the ones who agree with you don't have to have their minds changed. And the people who don't agree with you are not going to have their minds changed. So it's a little bit like, it's a type of entertainment in a way. And in the book, I call this the entertainment of conscience. You pick some injustice in the world, you're mad and you're up in arms about it, and this somehow makes you a good person, or somehow even is meant to stop this injustice somehow. Of course, it doesn't do anything like that. It may make you feel like a good person inside, but if you really want to get realistic about what's a good person and what isn't, a good person helps other people, does positive things, doesn't get mad at other. A good person does not necessarily or primarily go around mad at other people who are in that person's mind doing bad things. So I think that's an important point to notice and stress. It's very, very important because we are much more deluged with news, if you want to call it that, news, propaganda, entertainment. They're all kind of mixed into one kind of disgusting slush at this point. And we're subjected to it all the time. When I go out for a drink, I make sure to sit at a seat at the bar that doesn't have a news screen in front of it. I think it's important to keep abreast of the news, but having all of this, practically all of it negative news, just thrown at you all the time, I mean, it's upsetting. And you may feel, well, I'm suffering with these people who are suffering, or I'm mad at the people who are doing this injustice. But, basically you're still doing nothing. And the fact is, if I hate to break this news to your listeners rather, but there is absolutely nothing you are going to do about the vast majority of things that are bad in the world or that you believe to be bad. You are going to do nothing about it. Why? Because it's impossible anyway. One person is not going to make a change in all the terrible things that have happened, even in a positive way. The people who do make a difference are generally people who realize that they have a particular task to do in a certain area and focus on that. For some reason, I was thinking of Princess Di a day or so ago, and Princess Di in the 90s, before her death, was very active in a rather curious cause, which was the removal of unexploded landmines. Now, removing unexploded landmines is not going to save the world in and of itself, but it is a problem. It's something that can be fixed and can be dealt with, and it's my impression she actually accomplished a great deal in helping make sure that people didn't walk on some landmine that somebody set for a long finished war. It was doing a small, and she was like at the time she was heir apparent to the throne of England. She was going to be Queen of England, and even she can do comparatively little. So I think I am not advocating a kind of passivity. I do think, however, in fact, that this passivity of kind of getting angry and ranting about all those people you hate is almost a way of shall we say, protecting your inaction. You get mad at these bad people, and you're outraged, and your outrage makes you feel like a good person, so you don't have to do anything. And I'd say, well, okay, I think maybe the thing to do is let go of all of these resentments and grievances, which are doing you no good and are not fixing anything, and see what you might actually want to do in a positive way. I mean, I would, of course, always the moral in, I think, any kind of ethical teaching is to apply it close to home to those around you. Even in the New Testament, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. The neighbor, who is the neighbor? Well, people around you. It's all very well and good, to feel sorry for people on the other side of the world, but there are plenty of people who are feeling sorry for people suffering on the other side of the world who treat their own friends and family abominably. It might be better to reverse it.
And your book also discusses how, you remind me you're talking about what we can do. It reminds me of Krishna telling Arjuna about your sacred duty and sacred quest, and don't worry too much about the big picture. And this brings me up to moving on to Asia. You talk about how And you mentioned it, Christianity does talk a lot about forgiveness. And of course, Jesus talks about how forgiveness is a way we can remove our sins and have God remove our sins. It's very central to the religion. But in Asian countries, forgiveness really isn't that big, it seems. But it actually it is in a way, and that is through karma. Can you tell us about how karma works with forgiveness, Richard?
Well, it goes back to that line in the New Testament, forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. Let's just set Christianity aside completely for the time being. In Asian religions, notably Hinduism and Buddhism, there's the doctrine of karma, which sometimes not really very well defined as the law of cause and effect. It's also saying that a given cause has an effect like itself, good or bad, and eventually this is going to bounce itself back to you. And since Hinduism and Buddhism both teach reincarnation, there's of course to be considered not only the bad things you've done in this life, but in God knows what past lives. Of course, you don't know about that. Even people who have like some glimpses of past lives don't have very complete glimpses of past lives. So there's that hanging over your head, and in a way, it seems ineluctable, unavoidable, and inexorable. You can't get away from it, and there is taking it that far can lead to a certain kind of fatalism, and often does. So I'm saying, well, it may be that forgiveness is a way of turning the law of karma on its head, because if you get what you give, if what you give comes back to you. If you forgive someone, you'll be forgiven. The law of karma, from this angle, is inexorable still, but it's a little loophole that you can use to get out of it. I don't think this is really well understood in the Asian traditions. I don't think they talk a great deal about forgiveness. I have a good friend who was a Buddhist monk for many years, and I asked him, does Buddhism talk about forgiveness? He said, no, not really. It's not terribly. Buddhists talk about compassion, but forgiveness is not. If you asked a Buddhist, is forgiveness good or bad? He no doubt would say it's good. It's just not emphasized that way. What I'm saying is that, well, here's a way of turning the law of karma on its head. If the law of karma is correct as formulated, it should work. So give it a try.
Yeah, and karma on the topic of dealing with the world and finding out if God forgives and all this other stuff. You write that karma says neither accept nor reject what is before you. Mm-hmm. Could you expand on this?
Yeah, well, that has a lot to do with, I guess I use that, there is a kind of an old esoteric maxim that says neither accept nor reject. I think of that principally in terms of ideas. I mean, there are a lot of ideas out there, and the vast majority of them are ones that you're not going to be able to verify. Religious doctrines say particularly. Some religions say there's a God. Some religions say there isn't a God, which is right. I think if you take this attitude of neither accept nor reject, and particularly applying this, there's the idea of God. I don't have to buy into it. I don't have to reject it either. I can kind of contemplate it and sit with it and see where I go with it. It gives you a great deal of mental freedom. Now, of course, I'm not a conventional Christian. I don't happen to belong to a church, which is more really a matter of personal taste than anything else. I prefer to sit home and drink coffee on Sunday mornings and go out to church. Someone else may feel differently. I don't certainly think that you have to believe anything in order to be saved, which is what much of Christianity is trying to tell you. I'm working on another book kind of on God and the Bible and similar types of things. And I was actually writing a little bit about the resurrection of Christ. And, was Christ raised from the dead? I don't know. There are actually no eyewitness reports, except the Apostle Paul says he had a vision of Jesus that was like the others. He's the only firsthand account there is. And everything is secondhand. How do I know what happened back then? Again, I can say, well, I neither accept nor reject it. I don't feel it's necessary to believe in this, frankly, rather improbable thing in order to escape the flames of hell. On the other hand, I have to say, well, the world is a strange place. And to say categorically that something is just flat out impossible is not a statement I would be willing to make. So in terms of beliefs, I think this is very useful. It does go against much of Christianity, which claims that you not only have to be a good person and repent of your sins, and incidentally forgive, which is usually somewhat sidelined. You need to believe X, Y, and Z. And I don't think that's true at all. It just doesn't make any sense to me at all. There's particularly people with a conservative religious bent like to criticize supermarket spirituality. Have you ever heard that phrase?
Yes, I have.
And the whole idea is, well, you just think you can go and pick and choose your beliefs, like produce at a store? Well, yeah, I think not only do you have the right to do that, you have the duty to do that. You have the duty to yourself to say, this makes sense to me. This makes sense to me. Provisionally, maybe, but this makes sense to me. This doesn't make sense to me. This is totally irrational, and I simply do not believe it. I think you have the right and the duty to do that for yourself, and if that means picking and choosing from a lot of different doctrines and teachings, so be it. The things that aren't a matter of choice are basic ethical things, and these are universal the world over. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't lie, if at all possible. These are universal. Even atheists and agnostics believe this. So it's not a religious thing. These aren't some things you can pick and choose. But since everybody accepts this and knows, or at least thinks they know this to be true anyway, it's not really an issue. So I think that's I think belief is something you can be a little bit freer with. You don't have to believe something, and you don't have to disbelieve it either.
Oh, certainly agree. And something the listener should know is, and of course you talk about this in your book, is it's not just sort of an intellectual or a sense of freedom, but the power of the mind does affect reality. You write in one section how a group of people meditated on a focused place. I think it was Washington, D.C. or New York. And the crime rate actually did go down. And then you talk about another fascinating part. You talk about the dweller of the threshold, a concept from a writer we both like, Edward Bulwer Lytton from Zanoni. Could you tell the audience about this dweller in the threshold and how our mind can actually affect reality, our health, everything?
Well, yeah, it's a somewhat intricate subject, but a couple of things I guess I would say. One is, does the mind affect reality in some kind of literal sense? I think it does. Why doesn't it seem to in most cases, at most times? Well, because the mind is frankly not very stable. The whole point of meditation, or one of the points of meditation, is to bring some comparative stability to the mind. My life is confused. My life is disordered. Well, your life is disordered and confused because, in a way, your thoughts and probably your goals and actions are confused and disordered. If you bring your thoughts into order, it's much easier to bring order into your life, and what you need to do in any given circumstance becomes a lot more obvious. So that's why, to some extent, I would say, well, although it is true that you create your own reality, it's not true in quite the simplistic way that is, sometimes said. Now, I have my own belief, and I don't know, perhaps an instant or two of experience that leads me to think that there is a level of the mind where to think it really does make it real. And I'm not talking about you believe it's real. It can make things happen in the real world, in the physical world. We don't have access to this mind. Guess why? it would be really dangerous. It would be as dangerous for ourselves as it would be for everyone else. So what I'm saying what some of the old occult literature calls the dweller on the threshold is basically, and I described it this way, I don't know if I use this word in the book, it's a kind of sphincter between the conscious mind and this deeper, more universal mind that has much more power. And the whole thing about the dweller on the threshold is in the occult literatures, like in Bulwer and Zanoni, if you confront it, you may do yourself some damage. Why? Well, if the sphincters in your digestive system, if you just like pry them open, you're not going to do too much for your health either. The idea is that you can gently kind of have access to this universal mind through somewhat safer, somewhat more gradual processes, such as meditation. So the dweller on the threshold is, it's there. I mean, it's scary. I mean, the whole thing in Zanoni is, it looks terrifying. Well, it has to. I mean, it's like kind of like a bouncer to the door of the universal mind. No one will put a lovable 3-year-old child as a bouncer in a rough bar. It has to be that way. It can be disabled. I'm saying I think certain drug experiences can kind of force it open, with good or bad effects. And I think this is one reason the occult esoteric literature is so usually so negative about uses of drugs.
Yes, and as you very astutely put, and the ancients knew this, Hermes is the god of the mind, but he's also a trickster god. So that tells us a lot about our own minds, right?
Yeah, and the whole thing is, I guess one of for those of you who are listeners who are interested in the Kabbalah, I would say that Hermes is associated with a principle on the Kabbalistic tree known as Hod, or as I always pronounce it, Hod, which literally means glory, but it also means, the Greek equivalent also means opinion, appearance, and appearances deceive. How does it mean? Well, your mind, that Hermes aspect of the mind, is to some extent a sorting mechanism. I look across the room and I see something that I associate with a picture. So it immediately goes into the picture category. So I recognize it. That's called recognition, right? That's how recognition works. But since things don't always fit so well into these little boxes that we make, and moreover, sometimes things look like other things, so you can be easily fooled. This is just part of the mind. Of course, another aspect of the fact, and I think people are aware of this much more than they were, say, 100 or 150 years ago, is the rational mind is very rarely the boss. The rational mind is I'm talking about in terms of your life. Your rational mind is really making up reasons for something you decided you were going to do anyway. And that's called rationalization. We do it in enormous amount. I was just reading a book called On the Political Brain, and the book basically says, for the most part, rational decisions have and ideas have almost no effect how whatsoever on how people vote. It's all kind of an emotional reaction, and the mind cooks up its reasons after that. So in that sense, it's true too, because of course the mind can cook up reasons for anything. It's very smart, and in that sense, it can also lead you astray if what you set your mind on doing was crazy to begin with.
And to end, Richard, and this might be a bit of a segue, but as you mentioned, the Course of Miracles influenced your book and certainly has influenced your life. I have read it. My aunt is very much into it, so I've learned about it. And I've always thought it has a lot of striking similarities to Gnosticism in the sense that God had this crazy little thought and became us. The idea that Jesus is sort of the Logos and the Holy Spirit is into the in-between energy. I guess you could say it comes more from Jacob Bim. But you would say that the Course of Miracle has a lot of Gnostic themes, wouldn't you?
Yeah. It differs from some of the classic Gnostic systems, which seem to imply that the world is evil, and it says, well, the world is not really evil. The world is an effect of your mind. I mean, it goes much more into that theme of mind, than even I just did a few minutes ago. So the way you change your life, the way you change the world, is by changing your thoughts about the world. So rather, the world is in a sense a problematic place because our ego, and that's sort of the Course's name for the isolated, separated, ultimately delusory aspect of self, is in control, and the ego is, as the Course keeps saying, insane. So yeah, there are a lot of affinities with that, and I have to say, particularly sometimes I wonder if some of the Gnostic teachers weren't saying something very similar to what the Course in Miracles is saying, in much more cryptic language. They certainly, some of the Gnostics seem to be very much more modern than the Orthodox Christians of, say, the 2nd century. I happen to be reading a passage about Valentinus, the Valentinians, the Gnostics of the 2nd century, and they're being criticized by Irenaeus, of course, the heresiologist. They go to pagan services. They let pagans, into their own religious services. I mean, today, geez, this sounds a lot more open-minded, than you. I think that's one reason people are so interested in the Gnostics and why they have such a power for many people today.
But I guess in A Course of Miracles, it's not so much gnosis. It really is about forgiving yourself and forgiving everything around you so you can drop this veil of illusion. Return to the fountainhead. Well,
forgiveness is a way of that. To get specific about what the Course teaches, perception is not knowledge. And when it talks about knowledge, it talks about knowledge more or less in the sense of gnosis, as we would understand it. And forgiveness doesn't lead to knowledge directly. It leads, as the Course says, to true perception, which then leads to knowledge. So there's knowledge at the top, there's perception, which could be good or bad in between, and forgiveness, which is a way of, according to the Course, of perceiving rightly. Because this world is illusory. The Course goes much further into the illusory nature of the world than I do in the deal, and I specifically left out that aspect of the Course from my book because if you start saying the world isn't real, you get all sorts of arguments and yeah buts and that kind of thing. Yeah. That's a long. You read my book, The Dice Game of Shiva, and it talks about reality and what we accept to be reality, but going into that for a thing that's basically about forgiveness, I don't think it would have worked. It would just turn people off. So there are other books of mine and other areas in which I talk a little bit more about that. But for some things like look, just forgive and accept forgiveness. Keep it simple. At least for the purposes of this book and this exercise.
I agree, and like I mentioned, I'm already starting to use some of your techniques for my daily meditation and prayer. But I think that's all the time we have today, Richard. I'd like to thank you very much for coming once again on Aeon Byte and discussing your new work, The Deal, A Guide to Radical and Complete Forgiveness.
Thank you so much. As always, it's been an enormous pleasure, and I do appreciate how intelligently and thoughtfully and thoroughly you read my books.
Oh, thank you, God. It's a pleasure, Richard. It is a wonderful to read your book. It's no work at all, and I always come out a little bit more Sophia in my life after each one of your works.
Oh, that's nice. That's good to hear. So, okay. Well, thanks a lot, Miguel.